Guten Tag, ich bin Uwe Matthias Müller und ich freue mich heute, Sie zu einer neuen Ausgabe des DTalk begrüßen zu dürfen. Bei mir ist Alexander Brown. Er ist Consultant bei MERICS. Wir werden gleich noch lernen, was MERICS macht. Er ist China-Experte und hat an der Universität Peking und der Universität Melbourne studiert und hat dort internationale Abschlüsse erreicht. Welcome, Mr. Brown.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Brown, would you like to tell us what MERICS is doing? It's Mercator Institute for China Studies. What's the mission of MERICS?
Gladly. So, MERICS is the Mercator Institute for China Studies. We are an independent think tank based in Berlin. We're a leading think tank on China, and our core mission is to develop nuanced and better informed perspectives on China. We actively try to influence public debates on China here in Europe and in Germany specifically, and we try to advise decision makers in government and in business to make sound strategic decisions on China.
China is still the most populous country in the world, but the population is aging. What is the reason for this?
Yeah, it is aging. I think that you could break it down to three factors. So the first one would be improvements in basic health care, which have led to increases in life expectancy in China. So since the 1960s, China has steadily increased its life expectancy, and today people born in China can expect to live until they're 77 years old. So that's the same as in the United States. So that's one factor. The second factor would be the legacy of the one-child policy, which most people would be familiar with. This has been in place, or was in place, for over 3 decades. So from about 1980 until 2016, each family in China was only allowed to have one child, with some exceptions for families living in rural areas and those which belong to ethnic minorities. But the result of this was that the fertility rate fell to below 2 children per woman, and has stayed there since the early 1990s. And the third factor would be China's modernization. So, like all advanced economies, as living standards have risen, so have fertility rates fallen. And so even with the abolishment of the one-child policy in 2016, China still has very low fertility rates, and the government is actually struggling to increase those. So we see basically less babies being born, and the health system improvements, meaning that people are living longer, and as a result, the society overall is aging very rapidly.
Is the public in China aware of the demographic change?
The public in China is certainly aware of the demographic change, but I think it will be a huge challenge for most families, particularly the increase of particularly the increase of the ratio of dependents to working age adults. So in China, they talk about a 4-to-1 structure, where you have 2 working age adults looking after 4 elderly parents, and as well as that, their 1 child. And all these costs place a very large burden on working age adults in China. And I think as these older generations do require more intensive care, you could see a stagnation in living standards for many families, as they have these this additional burden that they need to manage. And the other factor, I think, which is important to mention, is that this will just be a huge challenge for the government overall in managing the transition to a more elderly society and aging society, which will put a drag on output. It will slow down economic growth. It will weaken consumption. Productivity is likely to also slow down, or increases in productivity. And all this will mean that people's disposable income and standard of living could stagnate or even decrease, which would be a big change compared to the trends of the past few decades in China.
You talked about the healthcare system, which increased, and is one reason for aging people. Is the Chinese health system prepared for rapidly aging population concerning manpower, techniques, and so on?
I think it's important to say that the healthcare system in China has made very large improvements over the past 50 years, and we can see that from the increase in life expectancy. But I also think that the accessibility and affordability of specialist treatment remains out of reach for many people. And so I don't think the Chinese health system is fully prepared for a rapidly aging population. So at the moment, about 19% of China's population is 60 years old and above, and that is set to increase to 30% by 2035. So that would be 420 million Chinese people over the age of 60 by 2035. That's 5 times Germany's population. So that's a lot of elderly people to look after, and I don't think the health system would be able to cope at this stage. The best reference point I have for this is really how China is managing the current COVID-19 pandemic in China. They're adhering to a very strict COVID zero policy where they use lockdowns to try and contain the spread of the virus, and they're not adopting similar approaches, to in other countries where we're learning to live with the virus, because they are very afraid that this health system will not be able to cope with a huge influx of patients, that there will be a large number of people who die as a result. In fact, one study produced by Fudan University in Shanghai, a peer-reviewed study released earlier this year, estimated that there would be 1.6 million deaths in the result of the government relaxing COVID restrictions. And so I think this just goes to show that the health system still has a long way to go, and this could be an issue in the future as well. Once the pandemic is gone, just the sheer increase in elderly people requiring care could place a huge burden on the health system.
What about the financial situation of elder people? Is a pension system in China designed for an aging population?
The pension system has made some progress in the past decade in terms of extending coverage to as many people as possible in China. But the fact of the matter is that the support that it offers is still relatively meager. It's divided into 2 parts. So there's one pension system which covers urban residents, those living in cities, and another which covers rural residents. And the amount of support offered to either varies substantially. So the annual pension income, the average annual pension income for urban residents is 43,000 renminbi. That's about 5,900 euros for 1 year. And in the rural areas, pensioners receive on average for 1 year 2,300 RMB. So that's only 315 euros.
per year.
That means there's a huge disparity. And at the end of the day, urban pensioners will receive enough to cover their basic living needs, to pay for food and these kinds of things. But in the rural areas, pensioners do not have enough to survive just off their pension. And this comes down to limited resources from available to the Chinese government. The one other key thing to mention here is that the retirement age in China is very low compared to other countries. So standard retirement age for men is just 60 years old, and for women it's 55 years old. The government has indicated that they plan to increase the retirement age gradually in the coming years, and they will certainly need to do that to make the system more financially sustainable. But ultimately, I think they will struggle to offer a really solid safety net for retirees. They will still need to rely on children looking after their parents in their older age to a large degree.
Let's have a forecast to foreign policy. Do you fear that the demographic development in China could tempt the party and government into foreign policy adventures?
Can you still hear me clearly, or is the internet connection still okay?
I hear you very well.
Okay, terrific. I think it's hard to say if the demographic development in China will induce it to engage in foreign policy adventures. I think China has two key goals which they'd like to achieve, and that is to assert their claims to sovereignty over Taiwan
So, Brown.
and the South China Sea. Parties for current Xi Jinping is really the one calling for the shots when it comes to China's foreign policy. But in terms of China's aging society, how that will affect China's foreign policy ambitions, I think probably the most direct effect will be its impact on economic growth. So I would say that the aging society will be a drag on economic growth. It could weaken China's overall power in the future, and that would make foreign policy adventures less likely, because any such adventure would also carry risks for the Communist Party. If they don't go well, that could also undermine their legitimacy at home.
So I hope you are on the right side. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown, for these views on China and demographic development in China. And thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.